I'd now like to introduce Dr. Michelle Mcmurray Heath, the President and CEO of BIO. A medical doctor and molecular immunologist by training, Dr. Mcmurray Heath's experience spans the executive branch, the U.S. Senate, the non-private sector, and the biopharmaceutical industry. Driven by her family's experiences navigating clinical trials and funding uncertainties within the rare disease community, she calls the distribution of scientific progress the social justice issue of our age. As an FDA official during the Obama administration, she was a champion of clinical trial evolution, the use of real-world evidence, and bringing the patient voice into agency decision-making. In government, she drove collaborations between patients and life science leaders, creating new entities like the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and National Evaluation System for Health Technology. Above all, she is a staunch believer in the power of science and innovation to improve people's lives. Dr. Michelle is going to make some opening remarks before introducing our first guest. Dr. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Carter. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to help kick off this crucial summit. It's such an important moment for clinical trial diversity. So, thank each of you for joining us here today. Many of you have been working to advance health equity for years. It has been your life's work. But COVID-19 shined a bright light on unequal health outcomes in the US and worldwide in a way that we had never seen before. More than 1 in 550 Black Americans have died from COVID. Latino Americans are roughly twice as likely to die from it as whites. Statistics like these, as tragic as they are, have made it clear that we must do better. It is time to do more. It is unacceptable for some people to suffer more than others. It's unacceptable for them to lack access to life saving cures and treatments. And it is unacceptable for them to be left out of trials that could ensure drugs and treatments meet their needs today and in the future. As a Black woman, I feel it personally knowing how distant science and medicine felt to the families and communities that I grew up with in Oakland, California. To many of them, novel cures and treatments were out of reach. That's one reason I became a physician and a researcher, to make sure that science spread further into the communities that needed it the most. This is a moment when opportunity can meet preparation, allowing us to make significant progress to help minorities and the underserved lead healthier and longer lives. Countless health and economic disparities, from the lack of paid sick leave to access issues in both rural and urban areas, contribute to unequal outcomes that I just mentioned. Fixing these inequalities will require systemic change, and clinical trial diversity is an important place to start. Ensuring that diverse groups are included in trials leads to a better understanding of how a therapy will work and its potential side effects. Lacking access to clinical trials can also have a direct impact on someone's health. The drugs being tested in trials are by definition cutting edge. And for patients with aggressive diseases like advanced stage cancer, sometimes a trial drug offers the best shot at a longer life. As we know, communities of color have historically faced entrenched barriers to trial participation. African Americans, for example, who make up about 13% of the US population, account for only 5% of enrollment in clinical trials. Latinos make up 18% of the population, but only 1% of trial participants. Using lessons learned from the pandemic, drug and diagnostic companies are exploring new ways to reach underrepresented communities. COVID vaccine maker Moderna, for instance, slowed down their clinical trial enrollment to increase representation of minority groups. Pfizer increased its trial size to include more minorities. Ultimately, Black and Latino enrollment in both trials came close to their share of the US population. While COVID-19 vaccine trials made progress towards equity, there is more that companies, research institutions, medical associations, and regulators can do to ensure that trials are more inclusive. And that's why we're coming together over these next 2 days. Clinical trial diversity is at the heart of BIO's bioequality agenda, which prioritizes justice through equity. At its core, our agenda aims to advance what we call just science. That's where the science being developed, the benefits it will bring, and the opportunities it creates can reach deeper into communities in a way that is more just, impactful, and inclusive. Science is the social justice issue of our age, and the bioequality agenda is a key part of BIO's arsenal to address unequal health outcomes and inequity. Our agenda aims to invest in the current and next generation of minority and underrepresented scientists and entrepreneurs, to expand opportunities for women-owned and minority-owned suppliers that really power the bioeconomy. And a topic we will focus on here to promote health equity in access to medicines and ensure diversity in clinical trials. Over these next 2 afternoons, we're going to look further at the steps we can take to improve clinical trial diversity. We'll discuss making trials simpler and more accessible. We'll talk about improving the documentation of minority representation in trials. We'll discuss novel ways to increase the number of investigators from communities of color, and we'll highlight the importance of companies having a diverse workforce, including in biotech. BIO is committed to working with all of you to identify and advance best practices to build a sustainable and inclusive clinical trial development infrastructure. And we want this summit to build even greater momentum behind improvements to clinical trial diversity. So to that end, I'll be moderating our first panel where we will hear from 4 leaders who are on the trenches of this work, fighting to improve health equity each and every day. But first, from another one of our vanguard leaders, I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Louetta Christensen, the Chief Medical Officer of the Indian Health Services Navajo area. As I'm sure many of you know, the Navajo Nation has fought a pitched battle against COVID, encountering multiple waves of the virus. Dr. Christensen and her team have worked to overcome numerous obstacles during the pandemic, including a nursing shortage, the highly rural nature of the Navajo Nation, and individual concerns about vaccines. Dr. Christensen grew up on Navajo Nation lands, but spent many years earning advanced degrees and working in hospitals on the East Coast. She brings a tremendous wealth of experience, perspectives, and insights, not only to the fight against COVID, but health equity and clinical trial diversity more broadly. Dr. Christensen, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So I know how deeply Navajo families suffered from the pandemic, but also that you made a lot of progress. Can you start out by just telling us how the Navajo Nation is faring right now when it comes to COVID?
Yes, thank you so much. Navajo Nation was hit extremely hard by COVID-19. More than once during the last 15 months, we were leading the nation in cases per 100,000, which is not a distinction that anyone would like. The social determinants of health are challenging for us at all times on Navajo. So over the pandemic certainly was devastating to us. The Navajo people, however, are strong and resilient, and we made it through 2 very intense waves of COVID in the spring of 20 and the fall of 2020. I am so grateful for the exceptional teams we have and those partners who supported us throughout this pandemic. On the good side, we began planning for the vaccination phase of the pandemic very, very early, far in advance of the release of the medications. So we were ready with our plan and a very intense distribution team. We have been very successful in our vaccine administration. Our cases are staying very low right now, but we are watching very vigilantly, and we have an excellent cluster investigation unit who responds immediately to evaluate and mitigate any outbreaks, even small ones, across our nation. Our contact tracing team is one of the best in the country, and we still maintain that team at a crucial level to be able to respond quite quickly to all challenges. We are slowly and safely reopening on the nation. We still have our mask mandates, and we provide guidance on safety with unified messaging every day. We are also tracking very carefully the variants across Navajo, and we continue to tell our people our best weapon, of course, is vaccination. Thank you.
Well, that's some hopeful news, and I hope we continue to see gains there. Are there unique factors to be considered when working with American Indian communities in contrast to other vulnerable populations?
Yes, of course. Each population has very important customs and beliefs, and even between all our tribes, 574 tribes, the Indian country, in order to be successful working with American Indians and Alaska Natives, you must be very cognizant that there is still significant historical trauma and trust issues. A very cultural, sensitive, and appropriate relationship must be established, and there must be very, very kind what is being done. We want to realize each tribe has their own uniqueness and ways of doing things. You must be honest and respectful at all times, proceeding with great attention to community readiness. Respected leaders and our elders and our medicine men must be included, as a community will continuously look to them for guidance. You must also understand the way people live, face every day, which are unique to each tribe, with some commonality in our challenges. I want to share quickly an excellent partnership that has sustained across the Navajo area with the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indians. This program recruits local tribal members, educates and trains them on the proposed research studies as stewards for the tribe. The help with recruitment and surveillance of the people who subsequently enroll in these studies, they are very comfortable with the research because their own people are involved in it. We've had successful vaccine clinical trials on the Hib, Prevnar, rotavirus, and we're now currently studying RSV monoclonal antibodies in our population. And then, of course, most recently, the Pfizer COVID vaccine that we participated in that trial. The staff from Johns Hopkins have integrated themselves into our community and become very trusted messengers. So we feel very grateful for them in helping us become more included in these clinical trials.
Well, I love how that illustrates how you have to have ongoing trust building and two-way communication to really see these gains. Do you think the same lessons and strategies could be employed to address clinical trial diversity across other underserved communities, or would you say that more wide-ranging or tailored approaches are necessary?
Well, thank you. I believe that a respectful and cultural sensitive approach is key to the approach of any community, particularly communities of color, for participation in a trial. Therefore, there's many principles that will become common in any clinical trial when you are enlisting these populations, remembering they suffer from health inequity and they're challenged with lack of transportation, extreme rurality, food insecurity, poverty, and lack of education access. Tailored approaches will come in, though, when you start your face-to-face work, because this is critical as you establish a trust to work together. It is not business as usual in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. You must follow the lead of that community. You adapt your process, or you won't be successful. Equity must be foundational, though, from the concept and planning phases, or else we'll never reach equilibrium and diversity that is needed for that trial. Remembering the hardest hit populations were the ones that suffer from the health inequity and face these determinants of health every day, and therefore they need what is being developed the most of all our populations. As you stated, we suffered from almost 2 times as many cases, 4 times as many hospitalizations, and about 2.5 times more deaths in Navajo Nation. So thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you, and I look forward to constant changes and inclusiveness in clinical trials moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christensen. I know how hard you and your team have been working to fight COVID, as well as to improve healthcare for all Navajo. So Thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do. We're now going
Thank
to
you,
take
ma'am.
just a short break before I moderate our next panel, learning from past mistakes and charting a new path forward. Welcome back, everyone. You'll have to tell me if it's time to dive in. We're supposed to be starting our next panel, Learning Past Mistakes and Charting New Pathways. That will run from 12:30 to 1:50. And I've got to say, just during the break, I got a news alert about a Kaiser Health study showing that over the last year, life expectancy in the US decreased 1.36 years for white Americans, 3.25 years for Black Americans, and 3.88 years for Hispanic Americans. So just another indication of how timely our conversation is today. So I'm seeing three panelists. I don't know if Dr. Elena Rios is with us as well, but maybe we'll go ahead and kick things off. So this is an important way for us to begin our summit, that we all have a similar sense of the history and the challenges when it comes to increasing clinical trial diversity. So this is really about laying the groundwork about what has been tried to date and what we've learned from it. And I'm here today with, hopefully we'll get to our fourth individual with, but with
There we are.
perfect timing.
Thank
Here
you.
with four talented and accomplished individuals who I will ask to introduce themselves in a minute. Each one of them dedicates tremendous time and energy to improving health of the underserved. And they're committed to health equity and making sure that more people can access high quality and affordable healthcare, which I believe should be a right for all. So you've already heard from me today. So let's hear from our esteemed panelists. I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves and their organizations. And I'd also ask you to tell us what drives you in your work. I think that's critical when you're committing yourself to the service of others. It can also be inspiring to our listeners. So Dr. Rios, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Dr. Elena Rios, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Medical Association. And I think that what drives me has been all of the doctors and medical students that we've been able to network with and find. There are so few of us around the country, but I think the mentoring and the leadership development, because that has resulted because of the network we have a lot of change agents, I should say, in our organization who have become very active in our chapters, in our interest groups. And today we're going to talk about some of those researchers who are senior versus sharing information with junior researchers. And I think that's really what drives me, is that I can see the very strong interest in working together to help our communities.
Perfect. And Silas, do you want to go next?
Hello, Dr. Michelle. Thanks for having me. Honored to be here. Honored to be with the panelists. So Silas Buchanan. I run an organization, the Institute for E-Health Equity. We're a social impact consulting firm based in Cleveland, Ohio. E-Health Equity, as the name infers, we are concerned, frankly, about an exacerbation of health disparities because of technology. So we spend quite a bit of time working with underserved community members and community members of color, raising their literacy around the benefits of adopting and utilizing technology to improve their health outcomes for themselves, family members, and community at large. That's on one side. On the other, it's important that we work with the ideators and innovators of health tech solutions to ensure that they're spinning things up in a culturally appropriate way. So recently, however, I've got to add that we recently decided to do much less consulting and toil more in the vineyard, do work at the community level. A few years ago, we established a really strong partnership with the AME Church. And for those of you that don't know, AME is the largest mainline historically Black denomination in the world with 2,000 congregations and 2 million members. And so with them, we have stood up amechealth.org. It has become the official health information dissemination for the AME Health Commission worldwide. We also recently stood up shepherdsconnection.org. That's another network of about 400 faith-based organizations across 40 states and 4 countries. And now we're working to stand up ourhealthycommunity.com is both a secular, so we can work with both secular and non-secular community-facing organizations. It's critically important that we work with our barbers, beauticians, nail techs, corner stores, as well as our our faith-based partners. So what drives us, as you can imagine, we have a lot of passion for this work, and we work across a range of healthcare stakeholders, payer, provider, government, and academic stakeholders, but on triple aim and quadruple aim type stuff. But now, pharma, med device, and life science organizations are calling, and the interest really is in discussing how they can engage community members. And for your audience today, I would proffer that a more compelling question really is, how can we make the clinical trial enterprise more important to those that directly influence community members, right? So my colleagues here on panel, physicians and healthcare providers, are a huge part of the equation, but the leaders of faith and community-based organizations have these historic relationships with underserved community members, and it's important that we engage them. A very, very quick stat: if you are typically healthy and a faith-based person, but typically healthy, you'll spend about 20 minutes a year with your physician, but 70 hours a year in church. So my drive and work lies in recognizing the importance of developing trusted and equitable partnerships at the community level with those organizations that are known, like, loved, and trusted by community members, and that's the work that we do.
Very important stat. Thank you. So, Dr. Morgan?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon to all who are in attendance this afternoon. And I'm so pleased that I came after Silas, because he has already laid out the entire discussion, and we can just reference the points that he has raised, but they are extremely salient points. And I'm sure that we will revisit them throughout the day. I thank BIO and its leadership for creating this important conversation both today and tomorrow, because achieving diversity in clinical trials has continued to be elusive in the United States and globally. I am Randall C. Morgan Jr. I'm a practicing orthopedic surgeon for 47 years. My life and my passion is now focused upon true understanding and elimination of all forms of inequity in health and inequity in life. I've served many roles, both local and national, with the National Medical Association, including serving as the 95th president during the years of 1996 and 1997. For the past 16 years, I've served as the inaugural executive director and now chief executive officer of the W. Montague Cobb NMA Health Institute. Through this work, I have come to fully understand the close relationship between the lack of diversity in clinical trials and the perpetuation of health disparities and health inequities. Today, I also seek solutions. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. And Tom?
Thank you, Dr. Michelle. On behalf of the Association of American Indian Physicians, which, by the way, is a national nonprofit physician member organization for largely American Indian Alaska Native physicians, I want to express our sincere gratitude to you and to the organizers of this panel for including this perspective. Too often, I state this today because often the perspective in these discussions from American Indian Alaska Native perspective is an enigma, meaning that often we're left out of the conversation for a variety of reasons. And I hope that we will explore some of those points in today's dialogue. AAIP is delighted to be included with the seat at the table for today's discussion, and I think our passion will resonate. So thank you, Dr. Michelle.
Thank you so much. All right, well, let's dig in. COVID-19 really drew a much needed level of attention to the issue of diversity in clinical trials. And for communities of color, their interaction with the healthcare system has been fraught with a history of bad experiences. But I don't think we should assume that every community has the same reason for concern or hesitation or even exclusion. Can each of you speak to the unique, specific underlying reasons why the communities that you focus on are hesitant or maybe hesitant to be part of clinical trials? I'm not sure who wants to dig in first, but. Not at all.
Hmm.
So I'll
Dr. Rios, do you?
happy to share. Dr.
no.
Morgan, please.
So just briefly, I think there are a lot of reasons for hesitancy with regard to vaccines. And I think the most important message today is that what was a hesitancy issue 3 months ago is not necessarily a hesitancy issue today, nor will it be 3 months from now. So that we need to working at this and educating ourselves as well as our constituency. But I think there's a lack of understanding of the history and process of vaccine development. And I think that is continuing, but because of the importance of the vaccine for COVID-19, there's been just a great emphasis on this. But for hesitant people, I've asked them, are they familiar with the development of the mumps vaccine or the measles vaccine and some of the untoward effects that may have occurred? And most of the time not. And so as a child of the polio era, it was a victory to get vaccinated for polio and to realize that you might not contract that disease. But so I think this history and process of vaccine development continues to confound many members in our community, certainly in the African American community. I think still the lack of a clear national health message that's affected by the political rhetoric is something that we have to continue to try to work for. And there's also a reluctance for many individuals to listen to the local message, the message that's going on in their own communities. And there are only a few trusted voices, we all say, but it is important that those trusted voices volunteer and answer the challenge to be articulate and to relate well to our community and to take whatever time is necessary to make that happen.
All right. Tom, do you want to answer that question, not just for vaccine hesitancy, but also for clinical trial hesitancy in your community?
You're on mute, Tom.
He's unmuted.
There we go. Yes, glad to. Thank you very much. You know, there are three profound issues that come to mind when dealing with American and Alaska Native communities and engaging them in clinical trials. One is tribal sovereignty, a lack of understanding of what tribal sovereignty really means. Secondly, there is a tribal health capacity, including infrastructure issue. And I'd say third, there's a lack of understanding of the root causes for a tribe's mistrust. And let me share a case in point. We've often recently heard through the COVID pandemic and clinical trials that were conducted by researchers that clinical trial researchers have their thumb on the scale when conducting clinical trials. And this is evident at issue is American Indian Alaska Native data. When the purported number of American Indian Alaska Natives involved in a clinical trial seemed adequate when we looked at the data, it showed several hundred. But when we examined this issue closer, there was some confusion. Only about 10 to 15% of that number were actually U.S. American Indian Alaska Native, whereas 85 to 90% were from Central America and South America. And why that becomes important is we make extrapolation from this data or from this information wrong, and often it's wrong because it's not applicable. Another issue regarding tribal sovereignty, and I'll be brief on this, some tribes, the United States government recognizes 574 sovereign nations. And we always have to keep in mind that what that means is these are unique sovereign nations, sort of like states. They have their own laws, their own court systems, their own health systems. So mitigating that becomes problematic in the typical sense for a clinical trial researcher. Permissions are to be granted by these tribes, and if you're a physician working in a tribal facility, then it's incumbent upon you to make sure tribal leadership is involved in this conversation. Well, with that, I'll get into some other points later. Thank you, Dr. Michelle.
Perfect. And Silas, what are you seeing as the origins of some of the hesitancy for clinical trial participation?
Yeah. So, I think that in many underserved community members' minds, and just many people generally, right, the clinical trial enterprise is inextricably connected with the healthcare enterprise, right? They don't see a difference per se. And if the healthcare enterprise is not trusted, then of course the clinical trial enterprise won't be as well. I live in Cleveland, and like many other places, Baltimore with Hopkins and other places, we have world-class healthcare here, right? However, a 1 square mile radius around many of these world-class healthcare facilities are underserved community members, and they have some of the worst health outcomes in the country. And so, think about that. Kings and sheiks fly in from all over the world to visit some of these facilities, but a 1 square mile radius, some of the worst health outcomes exist. So many of these community members don't believe or don't have trust in the healthcare system, right? And perception and reality, when those two things manifest, or the reality becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right, of the perception, then you've got these entrenched beliefs at the community level that are really, really difficult to unentrench, that things are not equitable around here, they historically haven't been, perhaps they never will be, and it deepens. And then it deepens further if the community engagement leads at the payer or provider level, or the PI of a clinical trial enterprise doesn't look like or speak like or reflect the community itself. And you only kind of come to talk to us when you have the NIH grant of the moment, or like a politician, every 4 years need us, it becomes a difficult situation. So that is, some of the things that we see.
Yeah, it underscores something that I find so frustrating. When I hear health leaders say, well, we need to have more clinical trial sites in vulnerable communities. And as you point out, a lot of our leading academic medical centers are in vulnerable communities, but they're not seeing and caring for those vulnerable communities perhaps as much as they should. Dr. Rios, what sort of origins of hesitancy are you seeing in your long experience in this space?
Well, I think for the Latino community, I have to echo what's already been said. Mistrust of systems, especially large healthcare institutions. I think the hesitancy has to do with lack of knowledge, but also there is a very strong family protectiveness among Latinos. And most of our families, my grandparents came from Mexico undocumented after the Mexican Revolution. And many of the families, especially in the Southwest and the Dominican Republic, the Cubans, there's lots of people that are not documented within the family. And it may be a grandparent, or it may be young people, but it just seems to me that one of the major hesitancies among our communities is this protection and being fearful of somebody being deported if they're found out. And the public charge issue, was horrible in the last couple of years, that there was the rules were set out and the comment period, et cetera. And just before COVID-19 hit, it actually went into, it became a reality that if you were a person who had a green card, who'd been living here for 5 years, 10 years, but you wanted to get food stamps or housing vouchers, that you could be deported. And so this last year, there hasn't been a real campaign to counter that fear. And then, of course, all of the immigrant bashing for Asians and Hispanics especially has been horrible in the media. So I think that's part of the hesitancy. And then I have to say that there really is a major problem with access in our communities too, that are poor, who don't have a car or don't have computer websites for research, to get into or to go get a vaccine. So those are just some of the issues.
Dr. Rios, you've also been involved in the NIH's All of Us research program, which I think seeks to collect and study health data from people living across the US as kind of a baseline. And one of its commitments is to recruit a diverse participant pool. Can you tell us a little bit more about the program's progress and what it's trying to achieve, and maybe how it could lead to more research by scientists in underrepresented communities?
Yes, I actually got the latest data. We have, so the All of Us research program is part of the National Institutes of Health. And honestly, it is the first time this country has decided to look at 1 million people with different types of research indicators, not only your own samples from your blood and stool, et cetera, but also your genetics and where you live, how you live. So just a lot of information about how you progress in your lifestyle and what diseases perhaps you would get over 10 years. The goal is to reach 1 million people. They feel that they will get it get that goal by 2024. And right now there's 388,000 people enrolled, and 80% are underserved, considered underserved, but 51.5% have a racial ethnic identity that the United States government looks at now. The major minority populations, of course, African American, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian American, and Pacific Islander. And I just think that's very, very phenomenal for any research to, but we have lots of partners around the country, including the clinics, the Veterans Administration, major academic centers, and lots of community partners from all of our different minority organizations. And I have to say the one last thing I'll say is that for researchers of the future, what's going to be important is this: all the data is going to be open access. So a future researcher will no longer have to go out and recruit their own individual participants in their research project. If they want to look at Hispanics with diabetes, for example, they have a whole lot of people around the country that will be available for them to do further study on. So that will decrease the costs and expedite the research in the future.
So have the participants agreed to not only be part of this kind of baselining study, but to perhaps enroll in future subsequent trials?
Yes, and also the participants get information themselves on how they're doing and their trend data. So it's really a win-win all the way around for the research enterprise as well as the individuals. And I have to say there's probably more people learning about research through this program than any other clinical trial in our communities that's been done. I mean, I should say outside of the vaccine trials for COVID, because we do know that they were all very extensively oversampled in our Black and brown communities too. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines.
Perfect. So Tom, I'm going to start with you on this next question, but I think others might want to chime in as well. You know, we know after 18 months of, as Dr. Rios points out, the COVID-19 education campaigns, communities of color feel like it's vital to see healthcare providers representing their population as part of the scientific community. And many of our panelists represent important organizations of healthcare providers from communities of color. One of the issues we need to focus on is how to increase the number of physicians and other healthcare providers from these communities that are involved in clinical trials as investigators. What do you think, and I'll start with Tom with this, what do you think keeps physicians from minority communities from being a part of clinical trials as they're operated today?
Talking to me, Dr. Michelle, sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Well, a great question. And I think that allow me to offer a little bit of insight into tribal health programs and physicians. You know, it's a bit different than what most people think, but you have to understand that tribal health programs are either managed or owned by the individual tribe, or it's provided by the federal government, largely through the Indian Health Service. With that understanding, I don't believe there's an issue with physician buy-in. The issue lies with that physician getting approval from the tribal government, or those that are engaged with the federal government typically stand down when these things come up, fearful. So I think tribal health, and especially physicians, they have discretion, but another driver is unrelenting mistrust of clinical trial researchers. That is an undertow that's often neglected, but it serves as the elephant in the room that is not spoken about. So I hope that that uneven playing field creates challenges for, in my mind, American Indian Alaska Native physicians. So thank you for the question.
Sure. Dr. Morgan, I know the National Medical Association, which focuses on Black physicians, has had a training program off and on through the years, through like over decades, to help train African-American physicians to participate in clinical trials. What do you think stands in the way of more Black physicians participating in trials?
Question, because it's quite comprehensive. The National Medical Association began a program entitled Project Impact. So it's actually what we call now Project Impact 1.0 in 1999. And at that time, the goal was to educate physicians about the opportunities for clinical trials, and at the same time to educate the community, to make members of the community more interested and open to being a part of the clinical trials. And there was an excellent training program for many years that was provided, I'd say for a decade. Each year at the National Medical Association convention, as well as at other meetings throughout the year, people would get excellent training from Dr. James Powell, and who was the PI, and Dr. Michael Lenore, and other physicians who had vast experience in working in clinical trials, and many of them kind of grew up in clinical trials. But what was found out is that even after individuals went through this training and were so-called certified as far as the National Medical Association was concerned, that didn't always lead to entry into participation in clinical trials on a local level. They were often said to be, neophyte investigators, and not necessarily welcomed into trials because of lack of experience. If they attempted to do the trials themselves, there was a lack of clinical coordinators and staff that were adequately trained. Of course, economic barriers were always and are still an issue. Considerably lack of mentors for young investigators, and sort of a lack of mentorship opportunity throughout the entire procedure. So what we found was training for about a decade. Then the decade afterwards, when the funding was much less, and circling back and trying to see if there was a great impact with this training, we're finding that we're disappointed that people were not nearly as effective, and even those who wanted desperately to be involved with clinical trials, to make it a part of their practice. And so that speaks to the fact that we still have a challenge, and we need to have a partnership with the pharmaceutical industry, the healthcare industry, with our education organizations, and organizations like the Cobb Institute that are focused on research and scholarship and the like. So the last thing I would say is that the National Medical Association now is launching a Project Impact 2.0, in which this is being reinvented, and many of the problems that I've addressed will now be addressed head on, and there will be an excellent discussion of this new endeavor through the National Medical Association Virtual Convention in July, and that will be open certainly to all members of our community, all the constituency members who are on the call today. And I would encourage people to join in and give us additional solutions.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Michelle, can I chime in real quick on
Yeah.
this? All right, great. So, my organization hasn't really been positioned to tackle this particular issue until very recently, but I'd be remiss if I didn't share that we've recently been contracted by Morehouse School of Medicine's National COVID-19 Resiliency Network, INCERN, to help them recruit about 100 to 150 faith-based organizations in the United States and the U.S. territories. And we'll manage them, those organizations, through our own platform. But it represents, I think, a very unique opportunity to partner with and knit in both industry organizations and provider organizations. And, we see, for almost a perfect underserved community engagement storm around the clinical trial enterprise, perhaps supported by industry, that would help us to marry health ministers and health ministries and community health workers that are embedded in underserved faith and community-based organizations, with physicians and PIs of color. We really believe that a health minister and a PI or a physician of color would be a powerful, culturally appropriate, and credible 1-2 punch to community engagement around the clinical trial enterprise, and maybe knock down some of the barriers that we've been seeing historically.
Thank you. So Dr. Rios, how do we get more Hispanic physicians involved in clinical trials, and what have been some of the barriers?
Well, I think we need to work with Randall and James Powell, and we have talked about working together because they have the curriculum and the expertise in really guiding, I'll just say guiding our minority physicians that are in solo practice, small practices. And we have to figure out, I think, how to build the support systems for them and how to train their data collection staff, how to have, better computerized systems, the data systems, the IT systems. I think for us, for NHMA, we started our organization 25 years ago, and we haven't gotten there yet. But we have had PCORI funding for patient-centered outcomes research. We developed over 3 years a mentoring program to identify senior researchers and junior researchers who were interested in learning how to recruit Latino community into the research programs. And one of the major models that we found was that academic researchers, those who really understand what needs to be done to write a proposal and get funding, et cetera, need to partner with community doctors. And our community doctors that work, for example, in larger clinics where you have lots of more staff, not just the solo doctors, or in community health centers where you have more staff, to be able to train to do the data collection and to promote the clinic where you invite the participants to be a part of a study, that you really do need that partnership. So the academic versus and community partnership, or eventually transition to a community partners with an academic or with a large system that already has clinical trials. But I think what's been missing is that we have seen clinical trials that the pharma companies are going to the same place for the clinical trials, and they're usually the large institutions where the doctors working in those institutions aren't necessarily interested in spending the time to educate our community to get involved in the trials, and they're just picking and choosing what patient they think might be more compliant or and easier to work with. And we know we have doctors who can convince our patients to get involved if they had the support to develop the research, which is what Randall and James and NMA have done all these years.
Yeah. Now you're touching on something really key, which is that, when a site is participating in a trial, and we've had this conversation with many of our member companies, it's not just the physician, but it's also the support staff that's helping to do all the record keeping and the data entry. And often if you're in a small practice, or you're in a practice that is more working on the financial edge, you don't necessarily have that excess staffing. And so we need to figure out how we can supply that extra support to the PIs. But Dr. Rios, you also alluded to something that is, I think, critical as well, which is the presumption that minority patients will not be as compliant, or will have too much complexity to be good subjects in the trial. And I'd just love to get you to expand on your experience on that front, and get the rest of the panel to weigh in. But before I do, I just will note that we will be going to audience questions that are starting to appear in the chat. Please provide your questions, and participants can vote on which questions they like more or less, and we'll get to those as a while. But the follow up to Dr. Rios. So, are these patients wanted in clinical trials?
Well, I think that when families, again, patients understand that the knowledge coming from clinical trials will help their families, they will jump at the opportunity to help. They're not asked. And I really do believe that we are minority people of color, have been marginalized in this country. And we still see that in, what was it? The big NIH study, the treatment. Okay, help me, guys. I don't remember
What was the topic?
Unequal treatment.
Unequal treatment. Yes. 2000 showed all the bias in our healthcare system among physicians. And, we're only 5% or less, all of our different groups of all the doctors in the country. So we have an uphill battle. I think if there's diversity, and if the diversity is a priority, then pharma companies need to fund our organizational leaders to be able to develop the regional approach. We talked about Morehouse. Silas, you mentioned Morehouse. There are Hispanic centers of excellence. There are Native American centers of excellence. But you know what our problem is? Unlike the HBCUs, we get funded maybe 5 years and that's it. There's not a consistent Hispanic or Native American center of excellence that could be the biggest treasure for the country for research, to develop our regional efforts where our people are, and connect to our community organizations, like our minority medical associations are really there to find and to facilitate what we can do to get more doctors engaged. And the doctors bring the patients, because all the patients gravitate to our minority doctors, as well as the clinic. So I'll stop there. But
no, I'm just going to show my own ignorance. I know the names of HBCU medical centers, and I know there are Hispanic serving institutions and Native American serving institutions, but I don't know the names of those medical centers. Do you want to share with our audience, because many of them are running their own trials? Maybe we can add them to the chat, so that those institutions also get attention. Tom, Dr. Rios, you want to?
Well, let me just say that they change so often. I can't pinpoint. Okay, so UC San Francisco has a great Latinx Center of Excellence led by Alicia Fernandez, who's actually on the board of PCORI.
I serve on the board with her.
And she's one of our NHMA fellows. In New York, we have Susana Morales, has a Center of Excellence. She's one of our NHMA fellows. So we've been able to develop the doctors that are leading these organizational efforts, but they don't get funded for more than 1 or 2 cycles. Dr. Fernando Mendoza from Stanford, Dr. Maria Soto Green from New Jersey. Those are probably the longest standing, 25 years of funding, but it comes and goes. And again, that consistency, the leadership needed to find more support, not just to rely on the government grant that comes and goes. That's what we need in our in our centers of excellence. And these are professional schools. The Hispanic serving institutions are usually community colleges or state schools because they have to have 25% Hispanic student enrollment. There are a few University of California institutions that have a medical school. Of course, Puerto Rico, those schools in Puerto Rico are considered HSIs, but on the mainland, they're not the research institutions.
Wow. So you're saying as of today on the mainland of the US, we do not have an HSI medical school that you can really point to. You have programs within other medical schools. Is that accurate?
Well, I'm just about.
Yeah.
Maybe one. I mean, University of Texas San Antonio is trying to get there. I think the University of Illinois, Chicago, and of course Charles Drew University has been both a historically Black college, and I'm not sure of the grandfather clause or what have you, and also an HSI because it is in an area with a lot of Latino patients and needs for Latino students now.
Right. Tom, do you want to jump in on this as well?
I will. Yeah, I would like to share a couple of thoughts. I certainly agree with Dr. Rios on discretionary funding versus mandatory funding, and that is problematic. You never know when the money's going to run out, whether it's through a cooperative agreement or whatever, and that is a challenge. But looking a little closer at tribal universities, it was only recently that a medical school was situated on Indian country. And it was at Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma as an extension of Oklahoma State University College of Medicine. They started with a class. Again, it is a state-run university, land-grant university. And we've got to keep in mind a couple of facts. 0.3 to 0.4% of graduates are American Indian. And it has been this way for 30 years. It hasn't changed. And you can make the same argument, whether it be dentistry, pharmacy, nursing, just on and on about what the low numbers are. So key to our association is to change this paradigm, shift this paradigm to get more American Alaska Native students into the health professions. And if we succeed in that effort, then we will have more physicians. But thinking back over the history of the American Medical Association, and how many American Indian graduates that they've had, it's I guess it's nauseating when you think about the number of American Indians. So we see some progress, even though it's an osteopathic school, at least it's some progress that we're seeing, that it is in a rural community, and hopefully if students will go there, they will go back to these rural areas. So we've got a big challenge in this country in educating and supporting minority students around the country, not just American Indian Alaska Natives. Asian Islanders, Pacific Islanders are in the same boat as Hispanic. So just pointing out the issue that we certainly needs to be addressed. So thank you, Dr. Michelle.
Wonderful. So, all of you were actively working on increasing minority participation before COVID-19, but we know that this put a little extra attention on the need. What are each of your organizations doing to really kind of leverage the momentum of COVID-19 to encourage broader minority participation of clinical trials in other therapeutic areas outside of the vaccines, for example? Has anyone been able to use this as a jumping off point?
Well, I would hope so. We'll see. We're jumping. I don't know how high we're going to get. But I think that developing the physician scientist, the physician researcher is extremely important. And what we were speaking of earlier in terms of funding for all of the institutions, in order to really do that successfully, there has to be significantly more funding available to not only the HBCUs, but to minority serving institutions, and particularly in urban areas that serve a great part of our population. There's got to be the opportunity for people to grow up in research and science. So when they start their practice, they immediately have a thrust of wanting to be in clinical trials. And it's not, something they're going to try out. And if it doesn't work for a couple of months and they start losing money, they'll bail out. They've had the experience during residency or fellowship. And many of the scientists that you've spoken of today are people who have been seasoned and were ready when they started in practice. So they've grown and their research has grown as they have grown, and their funding likewise has been very consistent. So I think that's one area that we have to really address, and the Cobb Institute has been doing that through our Cobb Scholars Program, and really focusing on trying to get more interest in those who are interested in both community-based participatory research as well as clinical trials. So that, in addition to those that of course are in the NIH R1 track, in many cases those are PhDs, but we're talking about dual degree physicians, or we're talking about physicians who've had a great deal of experience almost from undergrad and a thirst to be researchers. We have to find support, and I think industry has got to also look at ways to support those scholars, and I think we'll see great dividends in the future.
Yeah.
Yes, you were nodding.
For the NHMA, we have 2 programs that have resulted in identifying more Latino students interested in science. One is supported by the Office of Minority Health at HHS, and that's our College Health Scholars Program. And we've had 5 conferences a year in California, Texas, and the Washington, D.C., the East Coast, for our national conferences. And we have found about 2,500 college students who didn't have any kind of information from their own groups, whether pre-med clubs or what have you, on how to even advance into science and STEM. And I do think that there's a lot of interest in STEM, but the students don't have the networking or the mentoring. So we've been developing successful, it's actually a research project showing that if mentoring does work to continue the pipeline, and we all know we have to build the pipeline with more support. The other program we have is with NIH, and I know NMA has that program too, where we find interested residents in their master of residency, and also those that are in PhD, MD, PhD programs, and instructors who are really interested in research but are not there yet, and to be able to meet with NIH for a day before our national conference in the spring, in March. And I think that we could do more of that. Again, we have the interest and we have the databases, but what we need is sustainable efforts where these individuals can be added into a training program like the Cobb Institute, or an HBCU program that already exists. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but I do think that we can find them with the support.
And Silas, I know you guys are taking a technologically enabled approach to this as well. Can you share a little bit about your new enterprise?
Yeah, happy to do that. If I could just touch on what Dr. Morgan and Dr. Rios just touched on. It's important, certainly, that we develop more pitchers on the research side. No question about it. But we also must develop more catchers, right? More community leaders that understand this on the community side. And so, it's not just let's strengthen more pitch. It's not either or, it's and both. And so we certainly believe that educated and connected leadership at the community and faith-based level is key. We'll start working pretty intimately with faith-based leaders through our work with Morehouse School of Medicine. We'll develop Our Health Ministry training program that'll live underneath ourhealthycommunity.com to connect and convene and train and collaborate with these powerful community leaders so that they're in position to partner more equitably with researchers. As far as the technology that we're developing, some of the projects we're developing, I can share just a bit with you guys and definitely more to come. But we recently acquired diverseclinicaltrials.com, and we'll launch that site pretty soon, along with a host of partners that are passionate about this subject matter with us. We see diverseclinicaltrials.com as a culturally and linguistically appropriate clinical trials education, training, and resource center for both community leaders, but maybe more importantly, community members. Right? There needs to be a place where we can, in equitable partnership with industry, folks and healthcare providers and researchers and others, where we can educate community members as well about things like informed consent in a way that might resonate with them. We want to better connect them to the clinical trial enterprise and opportunities and resources so they can make intelligent, informed decisions through trusted sources about participating in the clinical trial enterprise. I will say this, we've been fortunate while we do a lot of work on the community side to be invited to also and be formally engaged with Milken Institute's Faster Cures work group on diversity, equity, inclusion in clinical trial enterprises, the Dime Society, Digital Medicine Society's work group as well. We've also engaged and provided thought leadership with Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and DCRI, HIMSS, and others. So it's a lot of horsepower at the table. We just want to make sure that these things are equitable in the industry side, and making sure that community leaders and organizations and members are prepared to participate equitably as well.
Well, we'll go a few minutes early to the audience questions because we have so many of them. So I'm just going to try to get through as many as possible. Our top ranked question right now is, what do you need to build an engagement infrastructure that is constant? How should biopharma companies be partnering or supporting community and physician education and engagement efforts? So we heard a little bit about this, that we need some consistency in the funding. Are there other directions that you want to give our biopharma companies in terms of how best to support your engagement work?
Well, I can suggest maybe a couple of strategies. One is to make the trials participation an asset for the patient's health. So this is from 30,000 feet all the way down, and a lot of this encompasses the points that were made by Silas earlier, that we're looking at an entire ecosystem here. And in order to make clinical trials meaningful and impactful, everyone has to be much more engaged than they have been. And so it's very difficult for patients to be periodically engaged in a clinical trial, or if it just so happens that someone in their family is in need of special medication, and they sort of get this epiphany that clinical trials are important. But we need to make it shown that this is actually an asset for people's health and will help to make them live longer. The trials need to be accessible, and they need to be friendly. They don't need to be imposing. Positive financial impact for the practicing physician has got to be a part of participation in clinical trials, for that, not only just for the physician, but for the entire staff and everyone that physician is responsible for. Mm-hmm. And then also to reimagine clinical trials. They don't have to always take place in one or two locations. They don't always have to have the same, community research organizations that are actually enrolling in the trial. They can be a lot more accessible to people in rural areas or people in underserved areas, but it takes planning at the beginning, not at the end when you're trying to oversample as we did with the vaccine, because we realized halfway through that we had abysmal numbers in terms of underrepresented minorities being a part. So I'd like to see a bit more of a grand scale approach to clinical trials rather than piecemeal.
Yeah, I would add the importance of the mentorship within the clinical trials. So like I said, we have a lot of pre-health students, and if we just mandated that, maybe they could get some tuition waived or discounts for the Kaplan course for their board exams. There's a lot of incentives that could be built in to have minority students be a part of clinical trials, and again, shepherd them into becoming the next generation of researchers. Just like the federal government has put so much funding into primary care incentives, right? Loan repayment. There's no reason why and we do have NIH supplemental grants for those that have NIH grants already that are already in research. It's expanding. It's using the opportunities that we already have, but having pharma companies supplement or complement. So I think there's plenty of resources out there just thinking out of the box. And I do think, just like Randall mentioned, that the clinical trials need to be reimagined, and they really do need to be part of our community's revitalization. The concept, the focus now is on social determinants of health and looking at poverty and education and the things that our communities have lived with, have had to deal with all these years. Well, clinical trials could be made to be, a part of a benefit and to learn about quality of life by seeing a doctor regularly and not just waiting to go to an emergency room. People don't have, a lot of people need the health care, and I think that it would be welcomed by people if they understood clinical trials in a different way, and especially with minority doctors being involved in clinical trials in the community, not in an ivory tower.
I love that. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? There's many more behind this. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Silas.
Well, I would just say that, industry really could be supportive of a community-based education curriculum, right? And it could start, frankly, with some education around the importance of self-assessment and early detection around any one of a number of things. How do we just begin to slowly connect the dots between folks that historically have not been trusted, right, with those trust brokers that are embedded in communities, so that we're jumping that chasm, so that we're building the trust. What are those mechanisms that we need to do that? If we've got a ready, willing, and able audience at the community level ready to do it, how are we adjusting behavior or messaging on the industry side or the researcher side so that we're jumping that trust chasm? Very interested in building those sorts of bridges. We have a lot of intelligent folks, educated researchers that are embedded in our communities that would also love to participate. And I think together we can find ways to get this done.
Wonderful. Okay. So we have a very interesting next question as well. Do any of your groups have approaches for identifying satisfied clinical trial participants to then share their stories with the broader community? Is that an approach anyone's taken or thought about?
Have in our I mentioned the PCORI funded mentor programs that we had. The beginning of that program was actually setting an agenda of what needed to be done to increase participation. And we brought in researchers and their patients. And in some cases, they were Spanish-speaking patients who really enjoyed being a part of a trial where they could learn and work within a clinic that they went to, but they just never had the experience. So I think it could be done even on a broader scale.
Silas, maybe that's a website-based endeavor. That could be quite
Perhaps I think the community health workers that are are working fairly intimately also with community members. I suspect they would have some very interesting stories to tell, both positively and negatively. I'm sure there are lots of success stories that need to be heard. So as we engage National Association of Community Health Workers formally, which we're doing, it'll be one of the questions that we ask. Let's start hearing from our community health workers around some success stories around the clinical trial enterprise. I like the idea.
Yeah.
Great.
Agree.
So what do you think about Medicaid covering costs related to clinical trials starting in January of 2022? What education is needed to ensure that we can help chip away at any barriers that patients might face to participation?
Well, and then there's the question of Medicaid. And it just because this will be an opportunity to perhaps enhance clinical trials, it still stands to reason that the patients first have to have access to care and care in the appropriate times and not just in an emergent time. So I think it's a promising concept, but I think it's going to require a lot of changes in terms of how people are able to access care in order for it to really be effective.
So Dr. Morgan, I'm hearing in that comment that you feel that sometimes patients within Medicaid don't have access to kind of more standard ongoing care that could get them exposed to these trials. Is that what you're pointing to?
Yes, I'm pointing to that. And I'm also pointing to the fact that in some of our states that don't accept Medicaid or have not funded Medicaid, those patients are having extreme difficulty getting care at all. So that the Medicaid plan that they may have is almost like a counterfeit check. And so I think it's just not going to be solved with one stroke of the pen. But it is something that we're definitely going to need to continue to support until we have, full health equity.
Now that was a deep tweetable comment that Medicaid is like a counterfeit check. I'm gonna have to let that one sink in for a moment. Tom, how are these affiliated costs really impacting patients that are participating with the Indian Health Services?
Well, back to the Medicaid question, you typically have a more impoverished audience or population, and associated with that, you have a sicker population. So it's going to be interesting to see how they're going to be able to keep the playing field level with this group. Although they can, but it may be a challenge. The other comment, if I may, tribal nations, tribes in general, were impacted greater by mortality with the pandemic than any other group. Wisdom keepers and knowledge keepers were passing at horrendous rates. So how is that a benefit? Is there a rainbow in that? Well, it brought focus back to tribal nations to center that we've got to be better. We as tribal health people have got to be better in our outreach and in clinical trials. So refocusing, re-energizing tribal leaders and elected tribal leaders and tribal nations now, I think has aligned where I believe that they're going to have a better reception based on that in the future. And the final point, if I may, are too often physicians are left out of the public health equation, at least in Indian country and in rural areas. And we're seeing that the challenge is what Dr. Morgan alluded to there, is access to care. And we can't overlook the fact that often, do I buy gas or do I feed my feed my family for the next 2 or 3 days. That is still alive and well in this country, not just with American Indians, but with the other people. So I'm throwing these thoughts out there to create awareness only, and that we do have many challenges ahead of us before we can take that first sigh of relief. Thank you, Dr. Michelle.
Yeah, we've debated within bio just kind of the ongoing stance on compensating patients for participating in clinical trials. We've had for the last several decades a stance that you don't want to create a perverse incentive of driving people into trials by offering them financial rewards for participation. You only want to cover their costs. But I often wonder if that goes far enough in minority communities where, you might not be able to take paid leave to participate in a trial. You might not have the transportation cost to get to a trial. Is it time to rethink that financial remuneration in trials, or would that tip the scale too far in terms of forcing people into clinical trials? I'm curious to get your thoughts.
I think one of the things that clinical trials could do is to introduce a broader way of looking at how people obtain basic health. And if maybe they didn't get cash in the pocket, but they got a higher standard of healthcare, which included the opportunity to participate in clinical trials, but also included timely examinations. It included regionalization of care. It included a lot of the attributes that normally they probably would not have access to. And that's kind of what I meant, is that, there's a bit of labeling that goes on when you have Medicaid. I've spent my entire life taking care of people on Medicaid. And so I understand sociologically as well as, in terms of health. So I think maybe if we could find a way to just show that we're really improving their health, and there's value in that might be better than trying to pay for a bus trip or, a food stamp for a day.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of what I meant by reimagining clinical trials and making it a whole different enterprise than it has been before, but one that builds health in our communities.
I really agree with what Dr. Morgan said.
Mhm.
As I said earlier, there's perception and reality, and when folks are knocking on the community's door because they have that latest $2 million NIH grant at the moment, communities are seeing that, and community members are seeing that, and many times they'll kind of connect and convene people in public housing, rumpus rooms, and hey, we'll buy you lunch if you just kind of listen. And so people are saying, hey, you're just offering us a ham sandwich basically for our data. And you have all of these dollars associated with this research. You haven't even invited the leaders of community-facing organizations that we know, like, love, and trust to the table to help co-create whatever the ask is. And at the end of the day, no data even flows back to those local 501c3. So they find themselves stuck at $10,000 funding levels from their local, Cleveland or Atlanta or Chicago foundation, because they don't have qualitative data around what's going on in their own communities, though they help to drive some of that data into the hands of others. So we've got to find a way to reimagine this, to be certain. People in communities of color feel like their bodies are wanted, dead or alive. I mean, I've heard stories, hey, after we pass away, bodies are delivered to the funeral home with organs removed. Well, maybe, somebody on their driver's license volunteered to have their organs removed, but the family doesn't know that, and they don't see that. And it goes to perpetuate the value of our bodies and our personal information without any equity knitted into it from beginning to end.
Dr. Rios, I saw you nodding your head. Did you have
Oh,
thoughts
the
on
only
this?
the only thing I could add, you asked about how to maybe target support. I would say that, again, going back to this regionalization that I was trying to talk about, I think where there are populations of color, minority communities, that perhaps there could be demonstration projects there with community organizations, with the community leaders that Silas was talking about, and also a media campaign, and make it part of the community. And also the doctors' offices need to be supported. IT is expensive, technology is expensive, and also having new staff involved, new jobs created um, that we haven't even thought about for doctors' offices the interoperability, dream of the United States. We should start with our diverse communities and being able to share data in a more efficient way with the community participants and with the physicians, researchers, as well as having those loan repayment or internships from the students that are going to take over, or the residents. So the idea, I think, is maybe making some small steps, lots of money in certain regions of the country that could be evaluated, and then take that to a higher level. But we haven't even seen that. I mean, like, everybody's talking about how individuals are being trained, but I think we need something bigger.
So we have a question here, and I should apologize because we don't have this point of view represented on the panel, but Joshua asks, I'm curious what the data says about Asian American and Pacific Islander representation in clinical trials broken down by ethnicity and immigration status. And I'll just ask the bio team if anyone has links to that data to put it in the chat, and also perhaps provide a link to the conversation we had around Asian American and Pacific Islander racism and barriers in biotechnology at our recent Biodigital Summit, which was a very fascinating conversation, and folks should watch it if they haven't already. We have a question: does all of us have any compensation to participants, and as well? So kind of related to the last question, Dr. Rios, does that all of us study compensate the participants, just out of curiosity?
I don't think so. I think it's all volunteer.
Okay.
I'll find out. But all of us.nih.gov is their main website.
Great. Yeah, and I think Kushbu, who leads our regulatory team at BIOS, put the link in the chat for folks who want to look at the All of Us study. So many of you have touched on the social determinants of health, but I'm curious what role you think they play specifically in clinical trial diversity. And I'm going to meld that with the last question and do one round robin on it. Because my final question was, what do you think are the 2 or 3 things that we should work together on as a broader stakeholder community after this meeting to have the greatest impact on clinical trial diversity? So I'll kind of give you a choice in the final round robin. Anyone like to go first? Social determinants of health. What are the couple of things that we can do together coming out of this meeting? Dr. Morgan, I'll start with you.
Okay. We've had a great opportunity to analyze our communities and the frailties of our communities. We need to take that same amount of time or more and try to understand how we can rebuild communities so that they will not ever be beset by something such as this pandemic. And that sounds rather simple, but there have been some discussions that we've had within the Cobb Institute and some op-eds that have been written about reparations and about how we can take these health crises and rebuild communities as well, because if they're not functioning, then neither will our nation function. The second thing is, I think we need to be able to create some databases that show interest. We were talking about the follow-up of community of individuals who have participated in clinical trials, for instance. So we need to learn more about those individuals, not only medically, but also where they live, where they work, and what impact the virus may have had on them or their families. And I think that will help us too to plan for the future in terms of social determinants.
Silas, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So thanks for the question. As I think about social determinants of health, maybe specifically, I just smile at myself a little bit because, faith and community-based organizations have been dealing with social determinants of health forever, right? Whether it's soup kitchens back in the day, or the church van that's taking people to their doctor's appointment, or after-school programs. We have been addressing the social determinants for quite the long time. What we have not had, right? We've been undermanned and underfunded, and haven't had the ability to capture and share data or shorten the distance downstream, consistently or as effectively as we could with community members, or upstream with the healthcare enterprise generally. So, seeking more opportunities to connect with each other. As I said, I sit around many tables. We're discussing about underserved community members and community-based organizations, but I rarely see the leaders of faith and community-based organizations invited to those tables. And frankly, you can't solve for something that you don't intimately understand. And you can't just glibly say, oh, we'll just partner with the churches. I mean, I've heard that a million times. We have all heard that a million times. That won't be successful unless you understand that culture. And just because you are, in my case, African-American, doesn't mean I understand faith-based culture. It has its own culture. So you've got to understand these cultures. So if we take the opportunity to connect with each other on both sides and take the time to understand the various cultures at play, I think now a very unique moment in time. And now's the time to really take some of these ideas, sit down together, and find ways to knit them together to make a solution that's equitable and mutually beneficial for all stakeholders.
Sorry, coming off of mute. Wonderful, thank you. Tom, do you want to go next? What are the things we should work on together coming out of this, and perhaps the impact of the social determinants of health?
Muted.
He's muted.
There.
I think we're back. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of information on social determinants of health and how it impacts the American and Alaska Native communities, and certainly see drivers of outcomes such as poverty, leading to health inequity, and, across the board for American and Alaska Natives. You can take almost any health outcome, and at the bottom of the rung on the ladder are American and Alaska Natives, and they endure. And a lot of that goes back to Dr. Rios. It's unsustained federal funding, largely for a lot of our all of our tribes. So. One, at least from our perspective, sustained funding, especially in healthcare, is going to be a critical advocacy item to begin the conversation on social determinants. We know poverty is a driver, and it always has been and will continue to be. We know trauma, historical trauma, generational trauma are also drivers of social determinants, leading to educational inequality. Even politics contributes to generational poverty. And we can go on and on. So with social determinants, we have to include in this discussion inequality, and also something that hadn't been mentioned, racism, because it is alive and well. So where do we begin? We should begin on all fronts. And it begins with having all the representatives at the table, not a few key decision makers saying, you're going to love, we've met and you're going to love what we've come up with for you. And that happens too often. We need to be a part of the conversation. Thank you.
I love that. Dr. Rios, you want to close us out?
Sure. I heard earlier the importance of timing. And I think if we've learned anything from COVID-19 in this pandemic, which is historic for our generation, is that public health is front and center, and that we can take advantage of the opportunity that people are paying attention to this, that health of our communities is important, that, you know, nutrition, having good food and fruit and vegetables, exercise, having places to walk, they're safe, you know, decrease crime. All these things in our communities are being paid attention to more. And at the same time, our racial, ethnic, marginalized people, you know, are also being understood as important to change the dynamic in our society, to have healthier lives. So there's two things that I'll just say right now. The Office of Minority Health actually just put out a grant on looking at data and how data providers can work with communities and community leaders and stakeholders on social determinants of health. No brainer. But it's the first time, and they're only going to give 2 grants. So, but it's a turning point in funding from HHS. The other big thing, and I'm just looking at this right now to get the right name, America's Health Rankings report for the first time is looking at social determinants of health.
Wow.
So there's a lot more opportunity to think out of the box now with clinical trials and research of our communities, and not just looking at the individual disease, but what's created those diseases, where all our stress. And the other thing I'll say is that mental health is really important. The mental health workers and workforce has never been supported in our country. I mean, you know what I mean? It's always been go talk to your grandmother, go talk to your mom, go talk, you know, you're crazy. Don't even bother trying to go see anybody, you know. And so I think it's just, we have a lot of opportunities right now to work together. And I would say that what's important is having the targeted resources with accountability and leadership at all levels, and that we document what we're doing to show the world that it can be done with our communities, and with all the expertise that we have. We just need to pass it on.
Wow. I cannot thank all of you enough for joining us today. What a fantastic panel, and a great way for us to kick off the summit. The summit is going to give us an opportunity to talk a lot more about a lot of the issues that have been brought up, and ultimately finding concrete ways, hopefully, for us to improve the health of people in underserved communities everywhere. So I'll now turn the session back over. And we hope you enjoy joining us for the rest of the day. And I and Bio are so proud to stand with the important work of the people on this panel and throughout the summit. And we'll have a short break before our next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.